Okay, here are the basic trigger types. Savage 204 has the AccuTrigger on it, as you can see there. On the AccuTrigger, if you want to pull just the trigger to replace the trigger, you pull this pin right here. If you want to pull the entire trigger group as a whole, you pull this pin here. The standard trigger, for lack of a better term, is the same exact setup. To pull the entire trigger group, you pull this pin. To pull just the trigger by itself, you pull this pin. Now the other side of the AccuTrigger and this trigger both, that pin is held in place by a little clip. There's a groove on the pin. That clip holds it in. With the Rifle Basics trigger, which is what this is, the trigger spring, there's a little Allen bolt right here. The trigger spring is inside right here. On this you have 4 screws. You've got a sear engagement screw, trigger pull weight screw, safety engagement adjustment screw, and the over travel adjustment screw. On the standard trigger, it's basically the same exact setup, only the trigger spring is different. For the standard engagement, or the standard trigger, that's your trigger spring, and on some models there will be a screw like this that is used to make some very, very minor trigger pull weight adjustments. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it does some. Now what these do is the trigger, and I will actually reattach this to this rifle that you're looking at now to show you how to install that. I'll do the trigger and the trigger group. But that trigger will set in there to be pinned in like this. This little loop, the trigger spring sets in that loop, goes sits in that hole, goes under that groove, and then rests on the post on the back of the trigger. Standard trigger has a post there. The Rifle Basics trigger doesn't. That's for the standard trigger spring. Now, some models will have this screw. On this screw, there is 2 sides to it. One side is just like a flat tip screwdriver. This side has 4 cutouts. What those cutouts are for is that they screw into this with the 4 cutouts up, and then the firing pin will fit down inside there. Those 4 cutouts hold it in place. You can turn that a little bit. You can turn that to change which of those cutouts that screw is in, and as it screws in and out of that post, it will add and relieve some of the tension on that spring, which will make very minor adjustments on the trigger pull weight. But trigger spring and trigger for the standard trigger, Rifle Basics trigger, and then the AccuTrigger. On the AccuTrigger, the pull weight adjustment is here, and then the spring that makes the safety work is here. Other than these 2 springs and the internal trigger spring compared to the straight bar trigger spring, removal and replacement of these triggers are identical. If you want to just put in the Rifle Basics trigger, which I like better than the AccuTrigger, my son's the other way around, he prefers the AccuTrigger. But if you want to replace just the trigger, you can buy a Rifle Basics trigger that is the entire trigger group, or you can buy a Rifle Basics trigger that is just the trigger. That's what I did. It's a lot faster, and you can actually replace that without having to take the entire trigger group out. To do that, what I like to do first is take the bolt out. It doesn't get in the way, but it's just one less thing to deal with. First thing you need to do is remove that pin. I just use a flathead screwdriver, push on it to get it started, and it'll click and it'll kind of stay in place. Once that's started, I put my thumb over the top of it so it doesn't fly away. Any little sharp pointed object to pull it the rest of the way off. And it's off. Just don't lose that because it's really little. That pin then just pushes right out. If it has any tension to it at all, You can just use a little brass punch. It should come out pretty easy though. Just push that out and it comes out. Now if you look at this screw, there's a groove, or this pin rather, there's a groove on it. Right there. That groove is what that little clip snaps into. Rifle Basics trigger has the internal trigger spring, over travel adjustment, safety engagement adjustment. Again, that's over travel adjustment, safety adjustment, trigger pull weight adjustment, and the sear engagement, which is for creep, that adjusts creep. Now, to replace the basic trigger, that just slides in where the other trigger was. If you have this screw, again, this screw goes inside this loop, and it goes in from the bottom with the 4 slotted side up and the 2 slotted side, which you use to make adjustments, pointing down. I'm not going to put it in there because this trigger's not going to stay on anyway. Trigger spring goes in that hole underneath this little tab right here, and then over the top of that post. That's what holds your trigger in place. That pin, doesn't matter which side this pin goes in. Slide it up from the bottom so you can see. Push that clip in. What I like to do is I like to push the clip in from this side because it gives you a flat surface to work with, that you can place your screwdriver against that flat surface to make sure that it goes on straight. And I cover it with my thumb to make sure that it doesn't fly away if it misses. Push on, it'll click and stay in place. And now your trigger's on. Alright, once you have that in place, have that back on, just do a function check. Reinstall the bolt. In place, do a function check. With the safety on, bolt won't move, trigger won't pull. Middle position, trigger won't pull, but the bolt will move. All the way forward, it'll pull. Middle position, won't pull, bolt moves. All the way back, bolt won't move.